Okay, so today we're going to talk about Karl Marx. This is the first of three videos on him and his ideas. The first one we're going to talk about is grand narrative, that is his view of how human beings have progressed over time, and then some of his concepts, including species being, specialization, and commodification. Uh, and then in part two and part three, we'll cover the rest of what Marx had to talk about. Okay, so Karl Marx was a collectivist, as we've talked about, and he's focusing on societal level factors. He basically argued that what he called the relations of production, that is, the relations between those who were producing things in society, that relations of production would determine people's consciousness or their perspectives, and so he was critical of societies as a whole rather than just being critical of individuals within those societies. So his grand narrative is a view of where human beings have been and how we've transitioned over time, and he says there's been several stages of human development, right? Starting with pre-class societies, or what he called primitive communism. Now these are made up of hunting and gathering societies, and primitive communism makes up the vast majority of human history. For well over 95, maybe 99% of human history has been spent with human beings being in hunting and gathering societies. We're going to talk about this as an overview. We're going to look at the different stages in the grand narrative, and then we'll talk about each of them in more detail. But this is the first stage, the pre-class systems or primitive communism. Right? That was followed by two stages which occurred concurrently: Asiatic societies and ancient societies. Then you had the development of feudalistic societies, and then finally we've arrived at what we are in now, the capitalistic societies. And this is what he was writing about. Keep in mind he was writing as the world was going through the Industrial Revolution. He's very critical of capitalistic societies, and he believed that they would inevitably change into first socialistic societies and ultimately into communistic societies, which he believed was the ideal type of society. So it's interesting to note that he believed that we began in what he would describe as primitive communism and ended in communistic societies. Actually, he would argue that true human history will not begin until we achieve a truly communistic society. Okay, so looking at these stages in more detail, you had pre-class systems or primitive communism, right? Here you had a group orientation rather than individualistic orientations, right? So the tribe or the hunting gathering tribe would have collective ownership of property, right? No individual would own things, but rather the group would own all of their possessions. And there was very minimal division of labor. That is, the only division of labor that would exist would be that based on sex and age. So two people who were of the same sex and the same age would essentially be playing the same role in society, the same role in the division of labor. Okay, in Asiatic societies, you had obviously these take place mostly in Asia, and you had some powerful despotic leaders, but they loosely oversaw the regions within their control, but those regions were largely independent. But there was a beginning of this early class system, right? This took place concurrently with what Marx called ancient societies, where you had this relations of production that we talked about in a previous video about slaves and slave owners, right? So the main conflict was between slaves and slave owners, and a tremendous difference in power, and you have this growing disparity between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. And also, this is interesting, he argues this is the time in which private property is developing. he's building off the ideas of, among others, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a philosopher who wrote about the first time, sort of the hypothetical idea of the first time a human being built a fence around a plot of land and called that land their own. This is, prior to that, would be completely foreign. It would be as if today we were saying, well, I own the air that we're all breathing, and you have to breathe that air, you have to pay me for that. It just seemed like a very odd idea. But at some point, that idea of land being a person's private property was developed, and it's developed in this ancient societies stage. As we talked about last time, the slave owners legitimated their position of power in the relations of production by claiming to be divine or being gods themselves. Right? They're more than human beings, and therefore that allowed them to be owners of human beings. This was followed by feudalistic societies where you had the relationship of production was defined as serfs and nobility. So you have a small number of a noble class which dominated and exploited the serfs. Now the serfs were not owned by the nobility, but they were indebted to or beholden to the nobility. So the serfs had to work the land and give part of their profit to the a small aristocracy that existed in the nobility. Now, what happened is over time you have the development of technology, both communication and transportation, development of larger cities, and with technological development came increased amounts of trade and commerce, and as a result you had an ever increasingly powerful and wealthy group of merchants that ultimately rose in power enough to challenge and ultimately overtake the noble class. And this was the merchant class, and their power was based on economics rather than some ascribed status that they were born into. And so over time you have this transformation from feudalistic societies to capitalistic societies, and these merchant class became what is in capitalism known as the bourgeoisie. So this relations of production in capitalism is defined by the struggle between the bourgeoisie, or another term for that were the owners of the means of production, or the capitalist class, and they are struggling in capitalism with the proletariat, or another word for the proletariat are the workers, the working class. All right. Now we're going to get into Marx's critique of capitalism in great detail in another video, but I just want right now to give you a sense of this transformation over time. And absolutely, this is where Marx believes we are currently, and he's very critical of this stage. Sees it as very exploitive. He argued that inevitably capitalism would change into socialistic societies, and the major difference between capitalism and socialism is that there's a public ownership of the means of production in socialism. Now, socialism is made out to be essentially a dirty word in politics in our society now, but it wasn't always that way, and there are some things back in the 1920s, 1930s, socialism was a much more mainstream political perspective. It's now in socialism, the idea is you're not ending inequality, but any profit or surplus value that is generated by the productive process would be put towards the public good rather than private gain. What he means by private gain is the profit motive. Currently under capitalism, any profits that you're made go into the pockets of the owners of those companies rather than going to help society as a whole. In socialism, any surplus value would go to the group rather than individuals. Okay, so in this stage, it's interesting. Marx argues that certain things that we now consider commodities or things that are bought and sold um, are provided to people in society. For example, education, food, shelter, healthcare. In socialism, these would be seen as human rights, that people just have a right to have education, the right to food and shelter, to healthcare and whatnot. In pure capitalism, none of these things are guaranteed, and you would have to pay for all of these things. Now, in some ways, we have a socialistic orientation already, because if you think about education, well, currently you're in a public university. Georgia State University is a public university. Anyone who went to a public school between kindergarten and 12th grade also got their education for free, paid for by the government through taxation, and that is a socialistic program. Food stamps, when it comes to food stamps is a government program that provides food for those that are in need. Public housing is an example of how we as a society provide shelter to those who don't have the means to pay for their own shelter. And now with the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, passing, we increasingly see healthcare as a human right rather than something that people have to pay for. And so when critics of Obamacare call it socialized medicine, actually they're actually right that it is socialized medicine. It's a reflection of a socialistic ideal. When they say socialized medicine, it's seen as a derogatory term, but if you step back and just think about it objectively, it is consistent with socialistic philosophy, and it's up to you to decide whether you think that is positive or negative, but it absolutely is the type of thing that socialism would do, and that is provide basic human rights to people and not make everybody have to pay for them. Okay. And finally, you get to from socialism, you transform into a communistic society. And like I said, Marx argued that this is the end of prehistory and the beginning of true human history, that we're not fully human until we've achieved this collective state of communism. So what is communism? Well, in communism, all people participate in productive process, right? You wouldn't have a government or a state, that people would be involved themselves in the decision making, and there would be a universal or extraordinarily widespread focus on what is best for the group rather than what's best for individuals. In capitalism, we'd absolutely focus on what's best for individuals, but in communism, there would be a focus on what is best for the group. Now, like I said with capitalism, we're going to talk about that in more detail. Later on, we're going to get into more details of both socialism and communism as well. I just want to give you a sense of this now. So, in communism, there would be no organized division of labor or specialization. I will talk about what I mean by those very soon. And there would be moral decision making rather than technical decision making. By technical decision making, I'm also talking about decision making driven by a profit motive. In capitalism, maximizing profit is the main determining factor what decisions people make, or what decisions companies make. But those are not always the best moral decisions. In communism, what is best for the group and what is best for our environment, for example, would be driving factors to determine how companies should act or produce things rather than what is the most profitable. Okay, now we get to a totally different topic here, named species being, Marx's idea of species being. And so what I'm going to do here is talk about several different concepts of Marx. And by the end of these 3 videos, I think you'll have a clear sense of what Marx is talking about. But there's no right order to talk about these things. I'll be talking about them one by one, and slowly you'll hopefully get a sense of the overview of what Marx was talking about. Now, so take the idea of species being. This is one of his major concepts. This is the idea that people who achieve the species being viewpoint place what is best for the group or society as paramount in their minds rather than what's best for themselves. So the species being viewpoint is essentially the opposite of individualistic thoughts. Now, Marx would argue in capitalism, we are driven by individualistic thoughts. We're taught to be individualistic, but he would argue that this is not consistent with our true human nature. Now, no one can be sure, definitively know what is human nature and what is not. Right? He's arguing that Marx is arguing that human beings are social animals, that they naturally have a species being viewpoint, that they naturally look at what is best for the group rather than what is best for them as individuals. Other philosophers disagree with this. And really, it is a philosophical question because we cannot, as social scientists, bring any evidence to bear on this question. You can't show through evidence what human nature is. So it's a question for a philosopher, or go to the philosophy department, take a philosophy class if you want to get into this. But from my perspective, I would argue that the vast majority of time that human beings have evolved, we evolved in small hunting and gathering societies where this species being viewpoint was much more prevalent than in individualistic thoughts. These individualistic thoughts that are common today and are common to capitalistic societies is a fairly recent development in human evolution. So despite that, there are definitely people out there who argue that we are, by our human nature, greedy and selfish individuals, and that's something that we're going to talk about here. Marx absolutely disagreed with that. He would argue, Marx believes that capitalism teaches us to be individualistic, and we lose sight of our true human nature, and that is a species being viewpoint. Now, what is the species being viewpoint? What's the effect of it? Well, if someone is coming from the species being viewpoint, they are going to take responsibility for the way they produce things and what they produce. And so a person, for example, may not engage in productive activity which is detrimental to the environment if the rewards are not worthy of that exploitation of the natural environment. So people will think about what is best for humanity and what is best for the environment, and make decisions in a moral way rather than just looking at how they can make the most money or the most profit. Okay, when you have a species being viewpoint, you creatively determine your own productive process in terms of producing things. The species being viewpoint brings people together, right? It unites people, and you can't have this species being viewpoint as an isolated person. You have to develop it within a group, right? Now, like I said, Marx says this is the ideal, to have a species being viewpoint, and it is more consistent with human nature, as we talked about. And the alienation that exists in capitalistic societies changes the species being viewpoint into individualistic thoughts. So he was arguing that naturally we have this group over self perspective called species being, and only through the alienated labor that we engage in capitalistic societies does that species being viewpoint transform into individualistic thoughts. Now, I acknowledge I haven't talked all about what alienation means, or related topics, but we will talk about that very soon. Okay, so another process that Marx focuses on is called specialization, right? Now, keep in mind, I mentioned earlier that he was writing at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and that led to specialization. That is where capitalists figured out that they could produce products faster and more cheaply if they made workers do specific things rather than the whole process, right? So we're talking about assembly line production. Most famously, Henry Ford created an assembly line where he could produce more cars more cheaply. What's interesting is actually um, Henry Ford learned about this, or came up with this idea of making cars through an assembly line, after he toured a butcher uh, uh, shop, where what was interesting, traditionally butchers would take a carcass of an animal and cut it up into different pieces, and the butcher would do each piece at this, all themselves. But this particular butcher who was being quite productive, had what he had done is he had figured out a way to be more productive. So he would hire, say, 10 or 15 different butchers, and he would place the carcass of the animal on a hook that would be able to be passed from one butcher to the next. And all day long, one butcher would take off one part of the animal and pass it along down the line to the next butcher, who would take off the second part of the animal, and it became much more efficient. Now the problem is that in doing this, people lose sight of the whole process. Well, to get back to my story, Henry Ford saw this, and instead of taking something apart like the carcass of an animal, instead he reversed the process and put something together, and that was cars. And it revolutionized production, not just in the auto industry, but in manufacturing in general, and created a qualitatively different type of capitalistic system. So another example of this, let's think about a shoe. Now, if you look at traditionally how a shoe is made, in the past, before assembly line production, a shoemaker or a cobbler would conceive of the idea of what kind of shoe he wanted to make, and he would be engaged in all those different steps along the way. So he would cut the raw leather into the shapes that he needed. He would sew the leather together. He would do all the different parts of the productive process, and at the end of the process, he could look at that shoe and see it as a manifestation of his mental and physical work. Right? He conceived of the idea of what the shoe ought to be like, and he took it each step along the way. But in capitalism and this particular form of specialization, that's no longer how this was done. After industrialization, individual workers would do each part of this productive process. So a shoemaker, a person working in a shoemaking factory, would just do one part every day. So they may take the right side of the sole and sew the right side of the sole of the shoe together, and then pass it on to another person. And they were essentially just doing what they were told to do, a very simple task over and over and over, and they had no decision making required. They were told, this is what you do, you do that, and so at the end, when they look at the shoe they produce in this assembly line process, they don't really have the same connection to the product as Marx would argue traditional shoemakers would have had. Okay, and we really essentially still do that today. The way we make shoes today is very similar, where workers work in large factories, doing what they're told to do without any true decision-making power, and Marx would argue that this is very dehumanizing or alienating, and that people are not built up by this process and do not have a connection with the product that they're making, but rather are exhausted by this type of work. And we'll talk about the process of alienation in greater detail soon. Okay, the concept I want to talk about in this discussion is what Marx called commodification. The idea here in commodification is the idea that everything in this society is seen as a commodity, or something that is bought and sold. Even people are considered commodities, right? Something that can be bought or sold. So let's talk about some examples that sort of make this point. All right. So here's a picture of a basketball shoe. And if you go back to the 1980s, basketball shoes became quite popular and started being associated with particular athletes. Michael Jordan, for example, Air Jordan basketball shoes were extraordinarily popular, and to the point where people would actually be robbed of their shoes. People would be held up and told to give up their shoes uh, on the street. Well, anyway, the reason why I bring up this example of the shoes is one time when I was going to class, I was in I walked by this shoe shop right across the street from the sociology department at Georgia State. Walters is the name of this shoe shop, and on this particular day, I was walking by, and there were a couple of dozen people in lawn chairs sitting outside of Walters, and I stopped and I asked them, "What are you camped out here for?" I thought it might be a protest or something. It turned out it wasn't a protest. It was these 23 people were waiting in line to buy a shoe that was about to be released. And it turns out why 23 people? It turns out that Michael Jordan's number is 23, and so they decided they were going to have 23 shoes sent to each store. But it wasn't a Michael Jordan shoe. What's interesting, it was a Kanye West shoe. Now, Kanye West is a musician, not a basketball player, and so the connection between athletics and footwear is more clear, at least in my mind, that what shoes and athletes wear is related to their performance and what they're doing. I don't see a real connection between a musician and the shoes they're wearing, but that point is lost on the people who are buying these shoes, I guess. It turns out that the Kanye West shoe was coming out, and it would cost at the time a couple $100 for each pair of shoe. And I was talking to these people waiting in line, and about half of them were there waiting in line to buy it for themselves, and the other half were waiting to buy it so they could turn around and sell it on eBay or some other place and make a profit. And they were saying basically that if they buy these shoes for $200, they could potentially, very likely, sell them for $400. And if it takes them 2 days to sit in line and they make a $200 profit, for them it's worth doing. An example of I looked this up. Some of these shoes can sell for a tremendous amount. Where they might, one example of these limited edition sneakers retailing for $245, but the bidding on eBay can, at least in one case, went up to $90,000. So what's going on here is that certain products are made to be very scarce, and we are taught that we want to have these very scarce products that other people don't have, and as potentially as a way to demonstrate how successful we are, how much money we have, we buy these things, and so it's an example of how things are made to be more valuable or more expensive than they're actually worth, or how much it takes to make them, simply because they're rare. Okay, another example is our t-shirts. Now here's an example of, I looked online to find a plain gray t-shirt. It costs $4.50, right? But many people pay quite a bit more for t-shirts. Here's an example of a t-shirt from a Nike website. A gray t-shirt, quite similar to the one for $4.50, but this one costs almost 10 times as much, and that's $40. Well, what's the difference between these t-shirts? Perhaps it's the way they're made, or what they're made out of, but I would argue the biggest difference is that the more expensive t-shirt has a Nike swoosh label on it, right? That if your clothes have this label, that's seen by other people perhaps as being more valuable. It's something to think about. What are these t-shirts really worth that much in terms of difference? Well, if there's some status associated with the second t-shirt, then people will pay a premium just to have that increased status. Here's another interesting example. and that is rims that are on cars, right? I remember this is probably 15 or 20 years ago. I remember driving along the street, stopped at a red light, and my car stopped. And I looked over, and it looked like the car next to me was still moving because the rims on the car were spinning. Now the car was actually stopped, but they had spinning rims, which at the time I'd never seen before. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Well, it turns out these spinning rims and now even really large rims are increasingly popular on cars. And I picked this out as an example because it's really an example of what I would describe as conspicuous consumption. That when you're in the car, you can't actually see your own rims. So it is a display really intended for other people, right? For people to look at you and to see your car as something special. And what's fascinating about this is that often the rims that are put on the cars are worth as much as the car that they're actually on. They can be extraordinarily expensive. And what's interesting also, I think, and makes this a good example, is that these large rims are not safer. They're actually more likely to result in flat tires because the amount of rubber on the tire is significantly less, right? But this is not a utilitarian decision that people are making to say what is the best, most safest mode of transportation. It is a status symbol to demonstrate to other people how successful you are, how much money you have. What's very ironic about this is in some cases people go into debt. They actually finance these rims, right? People will borrow money to put rims on their cars to demonstrate that they have money, which seems very counterintuitive and bizarre, really. But that's what our culture has done, is promoted the idea that we have to demonstrate that we are successful through our material possessions. And some people buy into this so much that they will actually go into debt to buy things to demonstrate how successful they are, which is truly problematic for their own personal finances. But the people selling these rims, if they get you to buy them, they don't really care what the impact is on your own personal economic situation. Another example of commodification is our handbags or purses, right? So the previous examples might be more linked to what stereotypically men might be into, tennis shoes or automobiles. Women certainly aren't immune to this kind of commodification as well, or this consumption. And these handbags can be tremendously expensive. $1,000, $1,500 a bag. You can actually, I found it fascinating that you can actually join purse clubs where it's essentially Netflix for purses, where you might you're sent you pay a subscription and you're sent a purse or a handbag, and you get to use that for a month or two, and then you send it back and they send you another one, and you never actually own the purse that you're carrying around. Instead, you're able to enjoy it, but then send it back, and it's essentially renting purses. Now, the result is that people, they look like they have a lot of money because every couple of months they have a new purse that they're carrying around, and so, and again, they're not necessarily doing this for the utilitarian value of the purse itself. I mean, a cheaper $40 purse could be just as effective as a $1,000 person carrying your wallet and keys and whatnot around. But people want to have these, in capitalism, people want to have these markers of success, and having a Louis Vuitton bag or a Gucci bag that costs $1,000 demonstrates to other people that you have money, right? People do this with other products as well. People might buy expensive wines, for example. You might spend $500, $1,000 on a bottle of wine. I remember actually when I was an undergraduate taking this same class. It was called something different, but it's essentially the same class. And I remember the the college professor talking about how he had gone over to a rich friend's house and they had split a bottle of, like a $2,000 bottle of wine. And it wasn't enough just for him to enjoy the wine with his friends, but then he had to go and talk to us about it and probably talk to other people about how special he was, or how privileged he was to be able to enjoy this bottle of wine. So again, this is conspicuous consumption. It's not consumed just for you, but rather you want to demonstrate to other people that you've had this expensive wine or whatnot, or some product or something. Now here's a pretty bizarre example, but when I heard about this product, I thought of this idea of commodification. Here, this is a hyperbolic oxygen chamber that you can buy for your dogs or your pets. The idea here is that you can have a kennel or a crate that your animal can sleep in that pumps pure or close to pure oxygen in, so they can breathe pure oxygen, and perhaps it'll be good for them somehow. Now this product costs over $12,000. Now it's not a product for people without a lot of money, but the idea that anyone would spend over $12,000 to buy an oxygen chamber for their pets seems bizarre to me. Very selfish, individualistic. I think of what could be done, what good could be done with that $12,000 in some other way. Now, somebody buying this may not care about what could be done for the greater good of society, but because we promote individualistic thoughts in our society, but it's something to think about. We have these products that I would argue are relatively unimportant, but the people with a lot of money may spend a tremendous amount of money buying these types of products. The last example of commodification I want to talk about is when Huggies and Levi Jeans got together and created a new product, which is essentially a diaper colored blue and looks like a pair of jeans for babies. Let's watch this video. It's a 30-second commercial, and then we'll talk about it afterward.
My diaper is full of chic. When it's a number 2, I look like number 1. I poo in blue. A limited edition Huggies jean diaper.
As you can see from this commercial, it's a pretty ridiculous combination, but people pay a premium, pay extra to have these diapers that make their babies stand out from the crowd. Rather than having just a plain white diaper, they're going to dress their child in a blue diaper. And really, these are products that are meant to be used once. They're disposable. Often they're underneath other clothing, not of course in this commercial. But the idea here is that presumably the child wouldn't care what colored diaper they're wearing, but the adults can demonstrate that they have the resources to pay for a special kind of diaper and set themselves apart from other parents, perhaps. So it's just another example of what I would call conspicuous consumption, the idea that people are spending money in order to demonstrate to others that they have the resources for what I would consider a pretty ridiculous product. So the last question I want to leave you in this presentation is, what in our society is not commodified? Marx would argue that everything is commodified, and I would like you to think about this, perhaps post on our Desire to Learn website examples of what you think are not commodified. Now, I'm not really talking about ideas here. I mean, things that people typically come up with when I ask this question are things like integrity or trust or those types of things. But I want you to focus on what physical object exists that is not commodified in modern capitalistic societies. Now, I encourage you to post any examples of this on our departmental website, and if you have any other questions about this presentation, please post them there as well, and thank you very much for listening.